Hello my friends, in today's video we will take a look at the camera setup on iPhone 15 Pro. As I've concluded in my first impressions video, iPhone 15 Pro offers pretty much everything that I've ever asked for from an iPhone. The camera setup is a separate topic and it is not the main highlight this year. The hardware is pretty much unchanged, but that is actually fine because there is a lot of room for improvement on the software side. In this video, we will take a look at the output and the features of the triple camera setup on the iPhone 15 Pro to find out how good it really is. The camera unit is very substantial, much like with the 13 and 14 Pro. I think that most people were able to get used to that by now, and I would say that it is actually the smaller camera setup of iPhone 12 Pro that looks a little bit weird, at least to me. There is one difference between the non-Max and Max camera setup this year. On the non-Max 15 Pro, we have the ultra-wide 13mm lens, wide 24mm lens, and 77mm telephoto. Max switches 77mm telephoto lens to 120mm. I much prefer having a 77mm focal length, but more on that later. The main camera uses a 1/1.28 inch type sensor paired with a 24mm equivalent f1.78 lens, much like 14 Pro. This is a very big sensor by smartphone standards. 48 megapixel resolution actually is a real deal. As I've shown in my comparison between iPhones 12, 13 and 14 Pro, it is by far the biggest leap in the history of iPhone cameras, but with some very significant caveats. The change from 26 to 24mm on the main camera on the 14 Pro has proven to be a good choice in my opinion. 24mm is in my opinion a more interesting focal length, a little bit more immersive and very suitable for landscapes, cities, architecture and so on. That 48 megapixel resolution also makes the zoom much more usable, but we will also get to that later. So how about the image quality? Last year I had to split this part into two parts, one for RAWs and one for JPEGs. The amount of detail captured in 48 megapixel RAWs from iPhone 15 Pro is incredible. High-resolution smartphone sensors are not a novelty, but iPhone 15 Pro combines that resolution with a lens that apparently can work with that kind of pixel density, which is a major technological achievement. As I've also shown in my 12, 13 and 14 Pro comparison, using JPEG mode would pretty much knock that image quality down to iPhone 12 Pro level. Fortunately, Apple now offers an option to shoot 24 megapixel JPEGs and I highly recommend doing so. These 24 megapixel stills are definitely a big improvement. The amount of detail is pretty solid. There is still a ton of sharpening, which is what it is. I don't know whether the general public actually likes that, but I don't. Honestly, for those who don't shoot RAWs, which is actually the majority of users, this switch from 12 to 24 megapixels will actually be the biggest jump in the image quality in the history of iPhone cameras. There is still a big difference between the RAWs and the JPEGs. The RAWs are not oversharpened, they are not oversaturated and not overly contrasty. The approach to image processing in terms of HDR and local tone mapping seems to be significantly toned down. With JPEGs you will still get fairly bright shadows, but the white balance in the shadows seems to be a lot better. I've noticed less situations with cartoonish rendering. The skin tones are still not ideal, but better than with 14 Pro. The ultra-wide camera seems to be carried over from 14 Pro. It uses a 12 megapixel 1/2.55 inch type sensor, which is a relatively large sensor for an ultra-wide camera. Ultra-wide camera on 15 Pro combines a dramatic 13mm equivalent field of view with solid image quality. The image quality obviously can't match the main camera, but again it is more than good enough for intended purposes. The processing is still the same deal as on the 14 Pro, so if you don't like excessive amount of sharpening and contrast, you will have to shoot RAW. The telephoto camera has the same specifications as on the 13 Pro and 14 Pro. It uses the smallest 1/3.5 inch sensor, but the images still look quite nice. The processing on the telephoto lens has been significantly improved on the 14 Pro and a little bit more on the 15 Pro as well. The overall image quality seems to be a lot better. I didn't like the 77mm focal length as a replacement of 50mm used until the iPhone 12 Pro, but now that we have a solid 50mm option, I am glad that the 77mm is here. That solid 50mm option is 2x digital zoom on the main camera. A huge benefit of that 48MP sensor is that it makes the zoom much more usable. Instead of using the normal digital zoom, it uses so-called live cropping, which means that it is just cropping that 48MP shot. Unfortunately, 2x zoom is still 12MP only, despite that 24MP are theoretically possible. The video is generally nice and still one of the best of all smartphones, but again with some caveats. It is very scene dependent. I was getting very nice naturally looking footage in a lot of scenes. The colors are actually pretty neutral and toned down for a smartphone. Unfortunately, high texture scenes such as this one are still brutally oversharpened. If you are expecting a major improvement over previous iPhones, that is not the case unfortunately. 15 Pro still shoots 4K up to 60p, which is fine, but there hasn't really been any improvement in that regard for years. For example, there is no open gate video, which would be useful for posting on both horizontal and vertical platforms. There is no 6K option, no 4K 120p, or anything special really. 15 Pro can shoot Pro RAW directly onto external SSD, which is quite special, but I will make a separate video about that. The ultrawide video is actually very nice, pretty close to the latest action cameras, and the processing is quite natural by smartphone standards. The video from the telephoto lens is the weakest. It is just obvious that it is a small sensor that can't capture that much detail, and the processing can't really make up for it. The low light performance is one of my favorite parts of iPhone 15 Pro cameras. The night mode has been around for a while and it works really well. It stitches together multiple images to get rid of the noise. That works on all three cameras. It actually goes up to 10 seconds with the telephoto camera if you choose max setting. The difference between RAW and JPEG is even more significant with night mode shots. The low light video is not bad either. The main camera uses a large sensor and f1.78 aperture, which means that it can let in quite a lot of light for a smartphone. Low light video is fairly detailed and the processing is pretty good. Ultrawide and telephoto cameras can't match the main camera, of course. The stabilization is excellent, again much like with 13 and 14 Pro. 15 Pro uses sensor stabilization on the main camera. Static shots and panning are super smooth. There is not much to talk about here. The party trick is again the walking stabilization. That is still super impressive. This kind of stabilization would be completely impossible without a gimbal just a couple of years ago. The ultrawide camera uses digital image stabilization, but that is completely sufficient at this angle. The stabilization on the telephoto camera is also fine. The lens stabilization stabilizes static shots very effectively, and that is basically all that I should ask at 77mm focal length. Regarding the autofocus, there is not much to talk about. On the main camera it is basically perfect. The focusing is extremely fast, the accuracy is 100%, and there is no hunting even in the low light. That applies for both stills and video. It slows down a little bit on the telephoto lens in the low light, but it is still very good overall. The ultrawide camera also uses autofocus. The main reason for the autofocus are probably the macro capabilities. It can focus at extremely close distance and take these macro shots with an interesting perspective. The native camera app is mostly the same. I like it a lot and I think that it is very easy to use and logically organized. One thing that I am extremely happy to see is the level. On-screen level makes it super easy to keep the horizon straight, which is an absolute necessity for good landscape or cityscape photography. Huge thumbs up for this. One more thing that affects iPhone photography a lot is the display, which seems to be carried over from 14 Pro. That is completely fine though. It is still a 6.1-inch 460 pixels per inch display with 120Hz refresh rate and 2000 nits peak brightness. Especially that peak brightness is very useful for photography. All kinds of content look great on this screen as usual. Dynamic island, HDR capabilities, and all of that good stuff is carried over as expected. The display is great overall. It is an excellent OLED panel with great contrast and brightness as well as the colors, so I have nothing to complain about. The only display related change is a thinner bezel. In combination with rounded corners and lower weight, it greatly improves the handling in comparison with 14 Pro. I'm also a big fan of titanium construction. I have talked more about it in my first impressions/unboxing video, which will be linked in the description. Another feature that indirectly affects the shooting experience is the battery. The battery is slightly larger in comparison to the 14 Pro at 3272 mAh. The battery life rating is the same, but I was hoping that the battery life could be a little bit better because of that 3nm SoC. In reality, it is very similar to iPhone 14 Pro, which means that I am able to get through a day of heavy use on a single charge, even when using 80% charging limit. Also worth mentioning is that much faster USB 3.0 interface makes files transfers much less painful if you don't use iCloud or AirDrop. To sum up, the cameras on iPhone 15 Pro offer a solid performance, but it is not the main highlight this year. The most significant improvement is the 24-megapixel JPEG mode on the main camera. Having said that, it should have been available last year, so I won't salute Apple too much for that. The biggest strength of iPhone photography remain 48-megapixel RAWs from the main camera. Those are excellent with great amount of detail and natural processing. The low light is very solid and the stabilization is fantastic. I would say that the HDR processing is a lot better this year. On the other hand, oversharpening in JPEGs is still an issue if you want to see iPhone output on a large screen. The video is nice, but there hasn't really been any improvement in the past couple of years. I still have to say that the iPhone 15 Pro is a very capable camera just because of that 48-megapixel RAW mode. The gap between the RAW output and the JPEGs that most people will be opting for is still pretty huge. As I've said in my first impressions review, apart from the camera, iPhone 15 Pro is actually everything that I've ever asked for from an iPhone. When it comes to cameras though, there is a room for improvement, especially on the software side. So that's it for this video, thank you for watching, I hope that you liked this video and that you have found it to be useful. Stay tuned for more videos and maybe consider subscribing if you don't want to miss my future content. I appreciate your feedback in form of thumbs up or thumbs down. If you would like to ask anything or share your opinion, please do so in the comment section, and see you next time.